My name is Quentin Turner. As was just mentioned, I'm a project manager and preservation officer with the audiovisual preservation subsection. I'm going to explain the background of my knowledge in this area, but I first, again, also want to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the country. I want to point out this presentation is being given on the traditional lands of the Darug and Eora nations as well. The presentation is called Sepia and Ice, and it's going to look at series A14518, which is the National Archive of Australia's collection of British Antarctic Expedition and Australian Antarctic Expedition's photographic glass plates, folders and albums, a collection that's been drawing a lot of attention recently. Presentation will look at the history and heritage of heroic and mechanical era Antarctic exploration, and I'll talk about what that means soon. We'll look at the key expeditions led by Australians that visited Australia that is covered in the series. We'll profile John King Davis, Australia's pioneer polar mariner, and look at how series A14518 manages and preserves Davis's personal photographic collection, which is now part of the National Archives. And we'll also look at a particular strength of the collection, images related to the 19709 British Antarctic Nimrod expedition. That was Ernest Shackleton's first expedition and John King Davis's first as well. And it's very much the centre, highlight and part of the magic of this collection. Now, I'm assuming people here are pretty familiar with some basic terms about museums, which when I've given this presentation elsewhere, haven't always have been needed to be explained. I'm sure you're familiar with conservation, preservation, descriptions, museum terms like that, but we use things a bit distinctly in the National Archives sometimes, particularly records is our way of talking about collection items. And we also have a particular way of talking about managing those records, which is called Commonwealth Records Series. And I'm going to be referring to that occasionally just for clarity. Now, you often see citations through this presentation, and A14518 is a CRS series controlled by the Australian Antarctic Division, which means they are the people who donated it to the collection. And this is a citation you'll see regularly. I'm going to show you a lot of images from the A14518 collection, and you'll see citation numbers. That's so you can track them later on. The first part of that number is the CRS series, and the second part is the control symbol. Now, just so you know who I am, as I said, I'm a project officer with the audiovisual preservation subsection. I've been looking at Antarctic polar heritage, the audiovisual heritage for the last 20 years, so I know a bit about it as well. I don't claim to be an expert on the expeditions, but I do claim to know a bit about the collections, the audiovisual heritage. And I've done some work doing reconstructions, for example, of Mawson's Antarctic expedition films a number of times. You can read an essay about that in a recent box set of Blu-rays that the British Film Institute put out, and also a couple of articles that are online. I'm firstly going to look at some key expeditions. And as you can see, a sense of history has been talked about with polar exploration as far back in 1917 when John King Davis used this slide to talk about the history of polar exploration. In our case, we want to look initially at what's called the heroic era. These are the most famous expeditions. Some of these listed here will be known to you. The Fram expedition is a Munson's expedition that was the first to the South Pole. The Terra Nova is Scott's rival expedition that ended in tragedy. The Australian Antarctic expedition, Douglas Mawson's first expedition. The Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition was the first one by, the famous one by Shackleton involved the Endurance and a miracle of survival. But some of these are not so familiar, even though they have an Australian connection. Japanese Antarctic expedition, for example. I wish we had time to talk about them, and also about the expeditions of the so-called mechanical era, which was largely a later period that was dominated by polar flights, the beginning of the use of tractors, and in the 1930s, some geopolitical rivalry, especially even the New Swab expedition, which was conducted by the Nazis in the late 1930s. But we very much have to concentrate on those with an Australian connection. And in this case, unfortunately today, I'm just going to talk about 4 or 5 which directly connect to the photographic collection we're talking about in A14518. And these 5 expeditions. Some will be familiar, most famously the Australian Antarctic expedition and Shackleton's endurance expedition. Some will be not so familiar, particularly, for example, the expedition that was a reciprocal expedition for Shackleton's endurance expedition, the Ross Sea Party that was meant to lay out depots for Shackleton if he ever had got that far to get beyond the South Pole and to come out the other side when he was attempting, as the original plan was, to cross the entire Antarctic. So I'm going to talk about those because they're going to keep coming up. Ernest Shackleton's very first expedition from 1979. Its main outcomes, it was Shackleton's first expedition. It was the first ascent of Mount Erebus, very first of the dash to the pole. Shackleton got within 97 miles from the pole and started a mad rush later on that ended up in Amundsen and Scott's rival bids to get to the pole in 1911, 1912. There was also a Northern Party, which comprised 2 Australians, Edgeworth David, Douglas Mawson on his first expedition, and Scott Alistair Mackay, who were the first to reach the South Magnetic Pole, although there's some dispute about whether they actually got there. It's had a substantial Australian membership. Douglas Mawson, Edgeworth David, Raymond Priestley, John King Davis, all on their first polar voyages. It also created a mania around the popular culture of Antarctic expedition. The lectures that Shackleton gave especially, and the film screenings as well, were a major international success, and they fired the imagination. There was a film that accompanied Shackleton's lectures that, by all accounts, was incredibly popular. Unfortunately, that's lost. And now, most familiar one to you here, the Australian Antarctic expedition, Douglas Mawson's great expedition of 1911 to 1914. Wasn't an attempt to get to the South Pole, but it mapped a huge part of the Antarctic continent and the basis for the modern Antarctic claims that Australia has in the Australian Antarctic territories down south. It's famous, of course, because of Mawson's heroic survival in the Eastern Sled Party, which took the life of his companion Xavier Mertz and Belgrave Ninnis. But other parties covered over 4,000 kilometres, while Davis commanded the Aurora on a 2,000 kilometre subantarctic oceanographic voyage, which learned a lot about the mysteries of the Antarctic Ocean. Its members played a substantial role in the Antarctic Australian experience. Douglas Mawson, Frank Hurley, the official photographer, and also geologist Cecil Madigan became a major geologist and explorer. He opened up the Simpson Desert in the 1930s, something which is definitely a topic for further conversation. There was a professional film which still survives, although not quite in the order it was originally released in. It had multiple versions. Douglas Mawson even lectured on Broadway with the film in March 1915. It's a story I've talked about in some of the publications I have elsewhere, and please feel free to look those up. And just a quick reminder about probably the most famous expedition of all, Ernest Shackleton's Weddell Sea expedition, in which his boat, the Endurance, was crushed. Seemed like tragedy was about to befall them, but of course his leadership brought the entire party out safely. A story that's told in management seminars to this day. And again, a very famous film accompanying it. Frank Hurley was on that party. He made a film that's known by In the Grip of the Polar Ice or South. You can see it's been restored in recent years. The reciprocal party that was meant to support the Weddell Sea Party is less familiar, but it's an important story. Inez McIntosh was leading it. They set up in the Ross Sea. They were going to set up supply depots to support Shackleton when he got to the South Pole, and then headed back outwards to make his transantarctic expedition. But unfortunately, the party itself struck a tragedy. Its ship, which was actually the Aurora, which had been hired again for the expedition, broke from its moorings and could not return to the Antarctic mainland. While it was gone, 3 of the party members died. from scurvy and malnutrition, and they didn't expect they'd ever get back. The Aurora was actually taken control of by the Australian government, who put John King Davis in charge of a relief expedition. Shackleton actually arrived in Melbourne in December 1917, thinking he'd be in charge, but at that time he wasn't a popular figure. He was actually forced to act as a supernumerary officer under John King Davis when the party was eventually rescued in January 1917. Many of the members of the Ross Sea Party were Australians, including Lionel Hawke, who built AWA into a major Australian company. And there's film fragments that have survived from the expedition, including some that were only found quite recently. Now, another thing that's important expedition that's less familiar but worth talking about here is Lincoln Ellsworth's polar flights of the mid-1930s. Attempts by Lincoln Ellsworth, an American playboy but also a very experienced aerial pioneer, to make the first Antarctic flights, transantarctic flights. Working with George Hubert Wilkins, a very famous Australian polar explorer in both poles, but not so familiar sometimes, but a celebrity figure in the 1930s, working particularly with the American media magnate, William Randolph Hearst. Ellsworth's attempt was successful, but he ran out of petrol and crash landed near the then unoccupied US Little America base in November 1935. Hubert Wilkins, who was a friend of John King Davis, but hadn't actually participated in the flights, lobbied John King Davis to organise a rescue party using the then research vessel Discovery 2, which located Ellsworth and Ellsworth's co-pilot Kenyon in January 1936. Ellsworth returned to Australia. He became a bit of a local celebrity and continued doing pioneer flights. I've just sent a note saying, can people see the photographic material that I'm shipping out? I would hope that they can see the presentation.
Yep, I can see the presentation. I'll just help Nicola out in the chat.
Thank you very much. And I should also note that, thank you for people's feedback. I should also note that the Wyatt Earp, which was Lincoln Ellsworth's expedition vessel, was purchased by the Australian government and it participated in the first post-Second World War Antarctic expeditions. I want to quickly point out Mawson's second expedition, the British Australian New Zealand expedition, Banzar, 1929 to 31. John King Davis was the first mate on this. It was a reunion of the old party. Frank Hurley was also the official photographer. But it was a contentious expedition that was supported by the Australian chocolate magnate, McPherson McRobinson. Again, it did a lot of work to establish Australia's Antarctic claims, and it's the basis of the Australian Antarctic territorial claims down south. But it proved to be fairly boring, arduous, repetitious, and eventually actually John King Davis fell out with Mawson and left the expedition halfway through. In the second year, the vessel, the Discovery, was commanded by Kenneth Mackenzie. Again, there was a film made of it by Frank Hurley called Southwood Ho with Mawson, released as a silent film and then re-released in a sound version called Siege of the South in 1931. Now, a bit about John King Davis in himself. King Davis is probably the greatest polar mariner of the heroic age. As he born in Surrey in 1884, died in St Kilda, Melbourne in 1967. As Shackleton said, he's the most experienced navigator of Antarctic seas living. He was the go-to man if you needed somebody to manage your vessel while you were exploring the polar mainland. He was ship's master on all three Douglas Mawson expeditions, the Nimrod expedition under Shackleton, Mawson's two expeditions in 1911, 14, 1929 and 31. And as I mentioned, he captained the Ross Sea Party Relief Expedition in 1917. He was dominated coastal navigation in Australia. He was the Commonwealth Director of Navigation from 1920 to 1949, especially responsible for coastal charting and for lighthouses. And he was a key advisor on the setting up of post-war Australian Antarctic expeditioning and the creation of ANARA, working alongside Douglas Mawson and Philip Law. He's a very private man. He lived in a boarding house in St Kilda Road in Melbourne for a long time. We don't know a lot about him. Even his diaries tend to just talk about business. But he was a member of the Royal Geographic Society and the Royal Society of Victoria for many years. He has a lot of accolades. The Davis Research Station is named in his honour, one of the major bases to this day in Australian Antarctic territories. And just a reminder that how far we've come. This is one of his charts in the NAA from 1907. And in 1907, they knew a bit about here, and a bit along the coast, but the rest of this was still territory that needed to be charted and filled in. This is Davis Station, and if you want to go to the link, you can actually see a webcam seeing what's going on there right now. Also, the Davis Sea is named after him. That's the area between 82 degrees and 96 degrees longitude. And there's very many resources you can look at. An important Australian Dictionary of Biography article, his own 1919 book with the Aurora in the Antarctic is at the Internet Archive. And you can look at various publications. You can track down a copy of his journals, which were published in the late 1990s, and his autobiography, which was published in 1962. His personal papers are in the State Library of Victoria and the National Library of Australia, and his charts are in the National Archives. I'm showing this one here, which is his chart of the search for the Royal Company Islands, which is fascinating because it was one of these ghost islands that were on other charts but was suspected not to exist. And famously, King Davis spent weeks looking for the island and eventually telegrammed the AAE to say, I've not located the Royal Company Islands, but cannot say that the Royal Company Islands do not exist. Now, a quick look at what's so important about this photographic collection. It's 8.59 metres held in Canberra. Contains photographic albums, folders of prints, postcards, lantern slides. Covers the following expeditions, ones that John King Davis participated in, but also ones that he had some professional connection to as well too. He was also a collector of Antarctic memorabilia. And some of his interest in polar exploration vessels, such as the American boat Sweet Gum, which largely operated on the North Pole, but always these kind of things took his interest. Majority of the collection was purchased after John King Davis's death by the Australian Antarctic Division, and subsequently in recent years it's come to the National Archives. But there are a few other parts to it too. There's a photographic folder from Thomas Libbel, who was a able seaman on board the Aurora, from Frank Fletcher, who was a chief officer under John King Davis, and from Frank Stilwell, who's a biologist on the Australian Antarctic expedition under Mawson. There are lantern slides. They're very important. They cover the key expeditions that Mawson was involved in and were being used as part of his lectures, much as I'm doing this lecture today. He was deeply involved in the preparation of many later expeditions. He would often talk about other expeditions that were familiar to people. Scott's two expeditions from 1902 and 1911 to 14. The work of Sir Hubert Wilkins, who was a friend of John King Davis, although less known in Australia, partly because Douglas Mawson wasn't a huge fan, and we know acted the campaign to keep Hubert Wilkins away from Australia. That's a fascinating story in itself, but he and Davis were close, and Davis would often talk about Hubert Wilkins' international significance, which is huge. Other expeditions, such as the early heroic hero ones, Mawson's Farm, expeditions from Belgium, France, Germany, although interestingly enough, not so often the sort of the boundary riding expeditions, such as the Southern Cross expedition from 1900, the very first Australian Antarctic expedition, which I'd love to be able to talk about, or the Japanese expedition, which was considered a little not appropriate and not gentlemanly. And also talk about the 19th and 18th century nautical precursors to the heroic age, the expeditions of Cook, Davis, Weddell, Dumont d'Urville, and James Clark Ross, which fascinated him as a mariner. A lot of his memorabilia. Here we see the Christmas lunch menu from Banzar, I think in 1929, with our leader, Douglas Mawson, and our first mate, John King Davis. There's a whole sub-history and subculture around Antarctic publishing. They took printing presses on a lot of expedition. They wrote poetry, they wrote newsletters. They published these fancy menus, which we often use a bit of cod French, for example, potage rosella is rosella tin soup. There's also some from the sort of the mateship of polar exploration. Here you have a 1959 meeting of polar old hands. Frank Hurley's there, Griffith Taylor. These are all legends of polar exploration. And a lot of these photographs were taken by Alan Campbell Drury in the 50s and 60s, was the Antarctic expedition's official photographer, an interesting character in himself. Who took these images? From 1907-09, variety of photographers, all anonymous. Basically anyone who was on the first Nimrod expedition under Shackleton took photographs. And but it was fascinating, the idea of taking photography there. Shackleton wanted to talk about that at length. A cinematographic machine, in order that we might place and record the curious movements and habits of the seals and penguins. Then on the Australian Antarctic expedition, I think Douglas Mawson learned from that experience of having everyone throwing their hand in that you needed a professional on board. So he appointed Frank Hurley as the official photographer and cinematographer, beginning their long and interesting relationship. But many of the images in the AAE were taken by others. Frank Hurley actually left the expedition in April 1913 and was not involved in preparing publication of photographs or editing the motion picture. And Richard Primer, who's a less known figure working at Gaumont Company, shot a lot of the footage that ended up in the eventual films, some of which you may know, the moving images preserved in the National Film and Sound Archives. Other expeditioners had their hand in. Xavier Mertz, who died on the expedition, and Percival Gray were great photographers. Unfortunately, their work is sometimes attributed to Frank Hurley. Andrew Watson took most of the western base photographs. A note that Frank Hurley was 1,000 kilometres to the east, so somebody else had to take the photographs. We know this, fortunately, because it's part of the contract with the this expedition, is that they had to be credited. And if you go and look at a publication such as Mawson's Home in the Blizzard, you will see their names of individual photographs, which helps us work out who shot what. In the Banzar expedition of 1929-31, Frank Hurley was back, although Mawson and Davis took some personal photographs. Some of the iconic images from Banzar are actually frame enlargements that Hurley took off his motion picture footage, for example, the one you're seeing here. Hurley also did have a bad habit of recycling AAE expedition footage from 1911 to 14 as part of the record. Some of that certainly turns up in the motion picture films quite strangely. In the Ross Sea Party photographs, they have particular poignancy because many of them were only rediscovered when they restored the Cape Evans hut in the mid-2010s. And many of them were taken by Spencer Smith, who died of scurvy during that party. Others were taken when the relief party by probably by Morton Moyles, who was part of John King Davis's party, who went down, was also one of the photographers who contributed to the AAE originally. On the Ellsworth rescue expedition, fortunately, the Discovery 2 had on board Alfred Saunders, one of the great polar photographers of the pre-war period. And if you ever track down a copy of a Camera in Antarctica, Saunders' book from 1950, you'll see many of those photographs. One thing that's interesting about the collection is it reflects what you might call a popular culture and commercial business of historic era Antarctic exploration. This was big business, and as you can see from the image we have here, sorry, I'll go back to that. It was commercial business. Shackleton's movie did huge business around the world as part of his lecture tour. You can see a bit of showmanship going on. And there's many accounts of Shackleton lecturing with the motion picture film, sadly lost, as I mentioned. And the posters promoting that. Again, it's so frustrating the lecture is lost. We even have many accounts of what it was. For example, this is a report from the Melbourne Age in October 1909 of what was the contents of the film. Again, so frustrating. The film did big business on the Australian silent movie circuit under the Spencer's Company. We also know that John King Davis used to use the film and also as part of that lecture excitement. Here we have accounts of John King Davis's lecture at Wellington in July 1912. And it helps us actually work out some of the images. For example, he talks at one point about a slide of Captain Cook, and that probably aligns with a lantern slide that's in the collection of Cook and explains why it was there. There's also a lot of detail about the motion picture footage and how that was used alongside the lantern slides. For all that, we still need to understand many of the images, and this is the greatness, I think, of the collection. We still understanding some of its intimacy. We're still trying to work some in the description. The description we have is derived from what came to us from the Antarctic division. Some of it's probably second or third hand, basically from John King Davis's notes. It's great to sort of do the interrogation and figure out the provenance. For example, this image of Shackleton is attributed to Ponting, but Herbert Ponting, the photographer and cinematographer on Scott's expedition, he wasn't there in 1907-09. This image is credited as George Marsden, but Shackleton's official book on the expedition, The Heart of Antarctic, says it's Douglas Mawson, and it certainly looks like a very young Douglas Mawson as well. Other photographs are uncredited, and we can work out who they are. This is clearly an image of Bernard C. Day, who was the motor mechanic on the Nimrod expedition. It also tells us that some assumptions we make are not always correct. It's often assumed Herbert Ponting and Frank Hurley are the first to figure out how to photograph cute penguins, but there's plenty of cute penguin photographs here back in 1907-09. The photographs, particularly from the Shackleton 1907-09 expedition, are a strength of this collection. They're unique to the collection, and unlike some of the others, they don't replicate holdings in other Australian institutions or in private collections. Certainly, for example, the Australian Antarctic expedition photographs are abundant. There's 3,500 in the State Library of New South Wales. There's thousands in Mawson's personal photographic collection in the South Australian Museum. And others turn up regularly on the antiquities market, of which is huge for Antarctic heritage. Alfred Saunders' photographs of the 1930s Ellsworth flights, of which there are many in this collection, sold for over 25,000 Australian dollars in 2006. But again, it's the John King Davis photographs which grab your imagination and have an incredible poignancy at times. They remind us of the travail and stress of polar exploration, even though the quality is not always outstanding. Here is a powerful photograph of a very young Douglas Mawson, probably back from his polar exploration with Tanner Edgeworth Davis and Alistair Mackay in order to find the South Magnetic Pole. You see that why they barely got that one alive. Similarly, Edgeworth David, a lion of Australian academia and geology, and still off fighting in the Western Front a few years later. He was in charge of organising mining and trench digging, but he barely got out of this expedition alive. Not surprising considering he was 50 years old. And we can see the wear and tear on his face coming back from the expedition. And there are other images which have a great poignancy. This is Alistair Mackay, again on the South Magnetic Pole Party. Mackay would be dead within a few years. He went off on the Stephenson expedition to Canada, which was tragic, and he disappeared basically when that expedition broke down. That took place in 1913-15. Again, another story worth telling. But some of the photographs just remind them that these were young men on holidays as well too. There's a photograph of Raymond Presley and Frank Wilde amongst the flax plants just before departure. And we have a lot of photographs which represent the fact that these were Edwardian gentlemen on holidays, again, part of the polar subcultures. There's so much I could talk about more. You can contact me at my ANA email address, and I'm happy to take questions later on. I'd now like to pass this on, hopefully, to Rodney Butler, Head of Preservation.
Hello, everybody. Back to me. Before we welcome Rod onto the screen, I'd just like to formally introduce Rod to you all. So Rod Butler is the Director of Preservation at the National Archives of Australia. Before joining us here at the Archives, Rod worked for almost 30 years at the National Film and Sound Archive here in Canberra in a variety of positions, including managing the NFSA's preservation teams. Rod joined National Archives over 4 years ago and currently leads the teams in Canberra and Sydney to preserve the National Archival collection of paper, photographic and audiovisual records. So Rod, well, thank you for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Julie. Can everyone see my presentation on the screen there?
Yep.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm speaking to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. Today, I'm going to be talking about the different formats that we received from the Australian Antarctic Division and a brief background of those formats, how they deteriorate, and how we've conserved and preserved them. I've worked in the field of photographic preservation for over 35 years, as Julie mentioned. However, despite having extensive access to early photographic records, including those depicting the Antarctic region, it was still a thrill to receive this collection from the Australian Antarctic Division. As Quentin mentioned, this collection includes almost 2,000 records across 6 photographic albums and 19 original prints. And I'll start by discussing those prints. The oldest surviving photograph in history dates back to the 1820s, but it wasn't until 1839 that the first practical photographic process, the daguerreotype, was introduced. However, photography was not readily available to a mass audience until the start of the 20th century. So even though the prints in the Antarctic Division's collection date from just a few years after this time, they're still in remarkably good condition. In fact, an irony of the photographic conservation is that often the more recent the film process, the greater the deterioration. You'll see on the screen some examples of the photographic prints from the collection, including Ernest Shackleton at Cape Royds Hut during the British expedition of 0709, and the loading of an Errol Johnston car on board the Nimrod. Shackleton estimated that the car might pull a slide 150 miles in a 24-hour sprint to the pole. Spoiler alert, it couldn't. The engine did not work at such cold temperatures, and even when it did, the car had no traction on the ice. Where the car failed, the dog prevailed. And you can see on the screen an image of Curly, Roland, and Weewolf from the BAE expedition of 0709. In addition to the photographic prints, the Antarctic Division contained 186 glass slides and glass negatives that were either 3 1/4 inches square or 3 1/4 by 4 1/4 inches. Glass negatives were first invented in 1851. The initial plates were comprised of a glass base that was usually rough cut by hand. Then it was coated in a collodion solution in the field. Then, while it was still tacky, the plate would be immersed in a bath of silver nitrate using a portable darkroom. This would make the plate photosensitive. The photographer would then only have about 10 to 15 minutes to take a shot while the plate was still wet. In some ways, glass is a great medium for photography because it doesn't flex like film, so it can produce very sharp images. However, wet plate negatives are fragile, the photosensitive surface can be uneven, and often you find the photographer's thumbprint on the image from when it was hand dipped into the silver nitrate bath. I should clarify that this information is for background only. None of the glass negatives in the Antarctic collection were wet plate, because by the 1880s, wet plate negatives were superseded by the more practical dry plate negatives. In 1871, Dr. Richard Mannix developed a process for machine coating large glass sheets with light-sensitive gelatin emulsion. Once dried, those sheets were cut down into individual glass plates. And because those glass plates could be dry when they were exposed, portable darkrooms were no longer needed. The glass was thinner with clean edges. There were no thumbprints or hand pour patterns. By the 1880s, dry plate negatives almost completely replaced wet plate technology due to its more consistent results, ease of use, and the faster exposure times. In turn, glass as a medium was almost completely replaced by cellulose film in the early 20th century, but was still used for astronomical surveys into the 1990s. You can see on screen some beautiful images captured by Bernard Day during the BAE of 1910-13 and by Frank Hurley in the AAE 1911 to 1914. One of the big advantages of photographic glass negative technology was that it was possible to make multiple positive copies of the negatives that could be used for display. Those positive glass slides were inserted into a projector called a magic lantern, and so the slides are often referred to as magic lantern slides. Magic lantern shows were quite popular, and many Antarctic expeditions, as Quentin mentioned, used them as part of animated lectures which raised funds to pay for their expeditions. Magic lantern technology actually dates back to the 1600s, when Thomas Waldenstern first coined the term lanterna magica. Those early shows used hand-painted glass slides to project an image onto a wall. The 19th century saw the introduction of limelight and carbon arc lamps that projected images over much longer distances with greater intensity. Photographic glass plates were introduced into magic lantern shows in the late 19th century, and this technology allowed for the mass production of glass plates, and it was possible to buy a set of glass slides to project at home. Later equipment was built with multiple lenses that would allow the projectionist to fade between images. Some lantern slides could also be animated by copying images onto separate moving plates. As a result, you could see things like a man falling off a horse or a rabbit hopping out of a pie just before it was about to be eaten. I hasten to add that I haven't seen any Antarctica slides that have been animated in this way. You can see on screen an example of magic lantern slides with their distinctive masking. Some of the most arresting images in the Antarctic Division collection were taken by Frank Hurley, as Quentin mentioned before, who participated in 4 Antarctic expeditions. During his trips, Hurley used about 7 film and glass plate cameras and at least 2 cine cameras, plus a mixture of lenses and colour and black and white film. He experimented with early colour techniques and flash photography, redefining the camera operator role into one that was far more artistic. Unfortunately, our collection of Hurley's beautiful images is not as extensive as it could have been. When the ship, the Endurance, was caught in the polar pack ice in 1915, it was decided that Hurley's glass plates were too heavy to be transported across the ice, so about 400 to 500 large format glass negatives were smashed. Fortunately, Hurley was able to save 120 slides, some of which are on screen now. Hurley would continue to evolve his use of photographic techniques to illustrate the emotion of the scene, not just how it looked. Ultimately, this did lead to some trouble for him when he used composite images taken on the Western Front in World War I, which were considered to compromise the truth. There's a lot of chemistry involved in photography, and all photographs start to deteriorate from the moment that they're made. Their lifespan is determined by how well they're made, processed, washed, handled, and stored. Photographic prints can fade due to residual chemicals in the print from the developing process, while fading can be caused by the oxidation from moisture, pollution, and incorrect storage. Glass plates can suffer from oxidation. The photographic layer can delaminate from the glass base due to the different layers expanding and contracting at different rates due to environmental conditions. They scratch very easily on both sides, and as you can see on screen, they can break very easily. Where possible, prints are repackaged into archival quality polypropylene sleeves and stored in acid-free boxes. With glass plates, you should always handle glass by the two opposite sides. And when placing the plates on a surface, you should ensure that they're placed with the emulsion side facing up to avoid scratching. You should never stack the plates or place any pressure on them. Each plate should be individually labelled, and the plates should be placed into individual polyethylene bags or lignin-free paper sleeves. Containers should contain warnings of any handling issues so that future users can know in advance that they may be flaking, cracked or broken. Glass plate negatives should always be stored on the edge to reduce the chance of breakage. National Archives is lucky to have a box making table which you can see on screen. We're able to input dimensions into a computer-aided design application, and then the table automatically cuts and inserts folds into acid-free board. This board must have already passed a photographic activity test, which ensures that the chemicals from the board will not interact with the records it stores over the lengthy periods of time. Similar sized glass plates should be stored together. The box should be nearly full so that the negatives stand straight up and are not under stress from leaning at an angle. If the box is not full, we use a piece of acid-free board to form a spacer to hold negatives in a vertical position. The boxes should be sturdy with dimensions appropriate to the length and width of the negatives, and the depth of the box is also an important consideration. Due to the weight of glass plate negatives, you should limit the number of negatives stored in a box. You should consider measures to protect your collection from vibration and shock, especially if you're using compactor shelving. You also want to ensure that your shelving can accommodate the weight of your containers. Dry environments around 35% relative humidity are ideal, and cool but not freezing temperatures will extend the life of the plates. However, more important is that the conditions remain stable as possible. If you're storing glass plates at home, then consider using a polypropylene box with a waterproof lid and place this inside another box made of similar material. Then place that box in a part of your house that is not commonly accessed. That will reduce the rate of change for both temperature and humidity in the plates, which can significantly increase their lifespan. We will always retain the original glass negatives or slides for as long as possible. The records have a value as an object in addition to the images that they contain. Also, you never know when new technology will be developed that will allow us to make even better copies than we do now. However, we have to make preservation backup copies as if they're the last time, as if this is the last time we'll be able to do that, because one day will be right. Digital technology is our preferred method for preserving these images. We use professional cameras that take very high resolution copies of the images, and the camera you can see on screen is capable of taking a single shot using up to 6 exposures, shifting the lens a fraction of a pixel for each shot in order to capture the highest quality possible. For those who are interested in technical specifications, this camera can produce an image that has 5,000 pixels per inch. You've probably noticed that the image on the screen shows our photographic duplication expert photographing a film print, not a glass negative, and that's because photographing a negative or slide uses transmitted light with all the lights off, and I wanted you to be able to see the equipment that we use. Now, no presentation about preservation is complete without a totally overwhelming diagram, and here I've given you 3. The point of this is not to overwhelm you with the details, it's to highlight that digital preservation is an ongoing series of activities that begins the moment that a digital file is created. Anyone who's tried to open a Microsoft Word file from 10 years ago will know that you can't just create a file and then forget about it. We need to ask ourselves questions about how we create a file without compression or proprietary formats to ensure that it can be accessed over many years. We also need to think about what content descriptions and other metadata is required to effectively manage the file. What software, hardware, and operating systems are required to access it? What backups do we need, and where are they stored? Who is keeping an eye on all the formats that we have so that we know beforehand before they become obsolete? What access restrictions are required? What cultural sensitivities might be involved? What ongoing budget do we need? What security is in place to protect it from cyber attack? What systems can we put in place to ensure that we can share information about our collection with other collecting bodies? And it goes on. Not only is this a complex task, we work in an environment that is constantly evolving. For example, what benefits does artificial intelligence and machine learning offer us? What risks do they present? You can be sure that a lot of dedicated archivists are working hard to answer these questions to ensure that these beautiful images can be accessed for entertainment and research for many generations to come. Now, Quentin mentioned the series number. All of the records that you've seen have been photographed and are available by the NAA's website. I'll give you a shortcut to finding those images. Just select the advanced search function on record search and enter that series number A14518 into the search screen.